Welcome to the MCC YouTube series on climate and the economy. My name is Jakob. I'm a senior researcher at the MCC and affiliated to the Climate Development Group. And I'm happy to share some insights on the role of global trade for climate policy. To date, the European Union has the world's most ambitious climate policy, and the European Green Deal envisages to make Europe the first carbon-neutral continent by the year 2050. This could have the effect of raising energy prices. And some observers have voiced concerns that these higher energy prices would lead to some kind of deindustrialization of Europe. The competitiveness on the global market could be impeded, and associated job losses could occur. In addition, there is the concern that emissions will be relocated to countries with laxer policies. This is actually termed carbon leakage. The academic literature identifies three main channels of carbon leakage. The first, the so-called energy market channel. This means that lower demand for fossil fuels in some regions will depress world market prices and give an incentive to consume more fossil fuels in other jurisdictions. The second channel is the competition channel. This means that higher energy prices will put European firms on a competitive disadvantage and drive energy-intensive industries to other world regions. The third is the so-called free-riding channel, which means that if the European Union imposes more ambitious climate policies, other countries might respond by lower efforts to mitigate climate change. What kind of evidence do we have of carbon leakage to date? The empirical literature points out that so far carbon leakage has not been a major issue. This is probably due to the fact that energy prices only play a minor role in a large majority of industries. However, one needs to take into account that in the past, climate policies have not been very ambitious, and the associated cost increases for the respective industries have been comparatively low. However, with higher mitigation targets, for instance, to go to a 2-degree target or a 1.5-degree target, the costs could rise. This could indeed make a substantial difference. To make predictions about leakage rates, that is the share of emission reductions that is compensated by increasing emissions elsewhere, many model studies have been undertaken. These estimates come up with a broad range, but the large majority of studies is in the ballpark of between 5% and 20%. So this means the carbon leakage could not entirely undermine Europe's climate policy, but might nevertheless severely lower its effectiveness. So there is a clear motivation to think about what measures could be put into place to tackle carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is due to the fact that you have different levels of ambition in different countries. So the optimal way to reduce carbon leakage would be to have comparable levels. If you had ambitious climate policies all over the world, carbon leakage would not be an issue. There are some encouraging signs that more and more countries are adopting climate policies. So for instance, this map shows you that carbon pricing, which is the economic instrument preferred by economists, have expanded all over the globe. That more and more countries have put into place a price of carbon, either in the form of carbon tax or of an emissions trading scheme. But nevertheless, there are important gaps in the map, and carbon prices in most jurisdictions are comparatively low. So what can we do in the short term to address carbon leakage? One thing that's already been done in the European Union is the free allocation. Most industries are required to submit certificates to be able to emit a ton of carbon. And these certificates can be traded on a market. So this imposes a cost on producers. According to the European Union's Carbon Leakage Directive, energy-intensive and trade-intensive firms are awarded such permits free of charge. On the slide, you can see the area A, which denotes all carbon-intensive firms, area B, which denotes trade-intensive firms, and an area C, which denotes firms of intermediate carbon and trade intensity. And all these firms are given free emission permits. However, we know trade intensity per se does not matter for carbon leakage, but only firms that are carbon intensive. And therefore, a large share of the free allocation of emission permits goes to firms that are not at risk of carbon leakage. And the reform of this free allocation will generate additional public revenues to the tune of 3 billion euros per year. Another proposal that is frequently mentioned, trade measures. The most popular form is the so-called border carbon adjustment, BCA. The idea of BCA is to level a carbon price on imports. This would require calculating the carbon footprint of all imports. Of course, this would imply some quite substantial administrative efforts, a lot of assumptions regarding technologies and emission intensities for different production processes. Even more important is that this textbook example of border carbon adjustment is economically inefficient. To explain you why, consider the case of steel imports to the European Union from China. So the European Union applies a carbon price on these imports. This, of course, would provide an incentive for Chinese producers to produce more cleanly. But at the same time, it would also provide an incentive to shift their production to other goods that are not exported, or they could shift and sell more of the steel they produce on the domestic market or in third countries. Trade measures not only are economic instruments, but also have a strategic dimension. Can be used as a way to kind of punish free riders. It has been suggested that countries could form so-called climate clubs, coalitions that apply harmonized border adjustments against other countries that actually lag on climate policies. And these climate clubs could also provide some positive incentives for members, such as monetary transfers or technology transfers. Tariffs would need to be applied in particular to politically sensitive sectors. Trade partners who are subject to BCA can be expected to respond on their own by retaliation. And this is especially cumbersome in a climate that is already prone to protectionism, such as now in the wake of a global recession. A pragmatic way to implement border carbon adjustment would focus only on a few energy-intensive industries that are at the risk of carbon leakage. This would actually not require calculating the carbon footprints of thousands or 10,000 or 100,000 of products, but only for very few ones. The substitution effect of shifting production to other sectors and selling carbon-intensive products on other markets should be taken into account by, on the one hand, modeling studies, on the other hand, use of empirical studies. The applied carbon tariff would result in a unified tariff for each individual import sector. And it also should be taken into account that trade partners respond to border carbon adjustment by imposing their own climate policies. In this regard, it's very likely important to engage in serious negotiation before applying such policies. There are two important constraints that need to be taken into account for the implementation of border carbon adjustment. The first is the legal aspect. International trade law, the World Trade Organization, puts some constraints on trade restrictions. There is some leeway to apply domestic taxes and regulations on imports as well. So, for instance, consider the value-added tax that can, of course, also be implied on imports. And for the case of carbon, such a requirement that treats importers in the same way as it treats domestic industries could well be implemented. In addition, there is the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, Article 20, which allows for trade restrictions if they can be shown to be necessary and effective in safeguarding environmental quality. To apply these measures in a non-discriminatory manner might be tricky, as it requires that you would need to assume that trade partners use the best available technology, and this would actually not impose an incentive to clean up their act for the most dirty producers, which also means that we'd forego a large part of the positive effect of such trade measures. The second issue that needs to be taken into account is the effect on trade partners. A border carbon adjustment, of course, imposes costs on the trade partners, on the exporters. And this is particularly important for low-income countries. There are certain ways to prevent that border carbon adjustment shift mitigation costs to poor countries. First, you can think about some exceptions for least developed countries. A second approach could be to convince countries to implement export tariffs. These export tariffs would have the same economic effects on exporting firms. However, the important difference is that the revenues of these tariffs remains with the exporting country. And finally, one could think about channeling the revenues from such border carbon adjustment to a fund that supports clean energy projects, mitigation projects in countries that are subject to such a border carbon adjustment. The EU climate policy can be safeguarded against carbon leakage. We find the right balance between economic, strategic, legal, and administrative considerations. In this way, the European Green Deal can proceed without putting the European industrial basis at risk.